It's 1963. Inside Pontiac's engine plant, the air smells like hot oil and ambition. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. Forklifts rumble across stained concrete floors. Cast iron blocks sit in neat rows, still warm from the foundry. Crankshafts wait their turn on metal racks, polished and balanced. And in the middle of it all is an engine almost nobody is excited about. A small V8, just 326 cubic inches. Not big enough to scare Chevrolet, not wild enough to excite drag racers who lived for weekend quarter-mile battles, and not flashy enough to make the cover of Hot Rod or Motor Trend. Walk into any Pontiac dealership in 1963 and ask about engines. The salesman's eyes would light up talking about the 389. He'd lower his voice and whisper about the 421 like it was classified information. But mention the 326? He'd shrug, change the subject, steer you towards something else. It was the engine you settled for. The engine for people who couldn't afford the real thing, the participation trophy of Pontiac's lineup. But here's the thing most people have no idea about. This engine wasn't weak, it wasn't badly designed, and it wasn't meant to fail. What happened next wasn't about horsepower. It was about politics, timing, and one brutal truth about the muscle car era that nobody wanted to admit. This is the real story of Pontiac's 326 V8, the engine that never got away with anything, and never got a fair chance to prove itself. Back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Pontiac was on fire. This wasn't the Pontiac your father remembered. Not the stodgy, conservative division that built sensible cars for sensible people. That Pontiac had died somewhere around 1957, and something dangerous had taken its place. This was the division that turned boring family sedans into street legends. The same company that looked at a mid-size Tempest and asked a forbidden question, what if we stuffed a full-size engine in there? The brand that proved Detroit could be fast, loud, and dangerous all at once. That question led to the 1964 GTO, and the GTO changed everything. Suddenly, Pontiac wasn't boring anymore. Pontiac was terrifying. The brand that made insurance companies nervous and teenagers dream. Under the leadership of men like Pete Estes and John DeLorean, Pontiac had transformed itself completely. These weren't typical corporate executives counting beans and playing it safe. These were car guys, racers at heart, men who understood that horsepower sold cars and legends sold even more. But Pontiac had a problem. Actually, General Motors had a problem. A corporate problem that would strangle the 326 before it ever had a chance to breathe. In the early 1960s, GM's corporate overlords made a decision. They were worried about safety hearings, worried about insurance lobbyists, worried about newspaper editorials blaming fast cars for dead teenagers. So they created a strict policy. GM's corporate rules strictly limited engine size in smaller cars. No more than 330 cubic inches in intermediate platforms. No exceptions, at least on paper. This was supposed to keep things reasonable, manageable, safe. But this was Detroit in the 1960s, and nobody in Detroit played by the rules. Chevrolet danced around the policy with creative engineering and executives who looked the other way. Oldsmobile pushed boundaries whenever they thought nobody was watching. Pontiac? Pontiac decided to play chess while everyone else played checkers. In 1963, they introduced a new engine, the 326 cubic inch V8. On the surface, it looked tame. A modest bore and stroke. A compliance engine, something the corporate bosses could point to and say, see, we're being responsible. But underneath that mild-mannered exterior, it was pure Pontiac. The bore measured 3.72 inches. The stroke came in at 3.75 inches. That near-square layout wasn't an accident. Pontiac engineers had spent years perfecting their craft, and they knew exactly what they were doing. A near-square bore and stroke relationship balances two competing demands. Shorter stroke means the engine can rev higher without destroying itself, but you need enough stroke to generate torque, that low-end pulling power that makes a car feel genuinely fast. The 326 walked that line perfectly. It could breathe at higher RPMs while still pulling hard from a standing start. Compression ratios ranged from 8.6.1 in base trims for customers who wanted smooth, quiet cruising, to over 10.5.1 in high-output versions that demanded premium fuel and delivered accordingly. Horsepower started around 250 in standard form, respectable, nothing to apologize for. But the real story was torque, over 330 pound-feet, right off idle, available the instant you touched the throttle. This thing pulled like a freight train compared to most small blocks of the era. Stomp the gas at a stoplight and the rear tires would chirp before you even realized what happened. And it did all this with thick cylinder walls, forged internals, and Pontiac's legendary durability. These weren't cheap castings rushed through production. These were blocks built to last. But there was a catch, and it wasn't mechanical. It was political. Pontiac was already famous for big engines. The 389 was the heart of the GTO, the engine that launched a revolution. The 421 was even more fearsome. In Super Duty form, it was a barely disguised race engine that somehow ended up in street cars. These engines made magazine editors drool. These engines made insurance companies panic. These engines built Pontiac's reputation as the performance division. So when the 326 showed up, nobody took it seriously. It was a small engine from a company famous for big ones, like being a lightweight boxer in a family of heavyweights. Nobody cared how skilled you were, they only saw what you weren't. And that's where the trouble started. On paper, the 326 was meant to be the entry-level performance V8, the gateway drug to Pontiac ownership, the engine that got young buyers into the showroom, hoping they'd eventually trade up. It went into Tempests, the compact car that would spawn the GTO. It powered Le Mans models with their slightly fancier trim, and later, it would find its way into early Firebirds. It was smooth, remarkably smooth for a pushrod V8, reliable in ways that made mechanics almost suspicious, and shockingly quick when properly tuned. In high-output form, with a 4-barrel carburetor and aggressive camshaft, it made around 285 horsepower. That doesn't sound wild today, but in 1964, in a relatively light A-body car weighing around 3,000 pounds, it mattered enormously. Quarter-mile times dropped into the mid-14s. That was genuinely fast. Fast enough to embarrass cars that cost twice as much. Top speeds pushed past 110 miles per hour. A well-tuned 326 Tempest could walk away from Chevrolet small blocks that looked faster on paper. It could surprise Mustangs at stoplights. It could humble anyone who judged engines by displacement alone. But the headlines went to the GTO. And the GTO had a 389. The GTO got the magazine covers. The GTO got the road tests. The GTO got the legend. Suddenly, the 326 wasn't the hero. It was the understudy, the supporting actor who never got top billing. Pontiac engineers knew what they had built. They had the dyno sheets. They had the test data. They knew the block could take more displacement if needed. They knew the bottom end was stout enough to handle serious abuse. They knew the oiling system was conservative but reliable, feeding the crank before the valve train. But corporate reality hit hard. Pontiac wasn't allowed to race the 326 seriously. Not in NASCAR, where Sunday wins meant Monday sales. Not in factory-backed drag programs, where quarter-mile times became bragging rights. And without racing, there was no myth. In the muscle car era, myth was everything. People didn't buy cars based on engineering specifications. They bought cars based on stories. Stories about what this engine did at Daytona. Stories about who got humiliated at the local drag strip. Stories that grew bigger with every retelling. The 326 had no stories, just silence. Then came 1965, and everything got worse. The GTO exploded in popularity beyond anything Pontiac expected. They had planned for maybe 5,000 sales. They sold over 32,000. Magazine covers screamed about 0 to 60 times and burnout tests. Every automotive journalist wanted seat time in a GTO. And the 326, it quietly stayed in the background. Present, but unnoticed. Available, but unwanted. Even worse, Pontiac introduced the 400 V8 shortly after. Same basic architecture, same design philosophy, just more bore, more displacement, more power, more of everything buyers actually wanted. The 400 made over 330 horsepower in standard form. With the right options, it pushed well past 350. Why would anyone choose a 326 when a 400 existed? The answer was almost nobody did. Here's the cruel part, the part that should make enthusiasts angry. The 326 was actually better suited for daily driving than the bigger engines. It revved cleaner, with less vibration and smoother power delivery. It ran cooler, putting less stress on cooling systems. It put less stress on transmissions and rear ends, components that broke under big block torque, and with its smaller pistons and shorter stroke, it had less rotating mass, meaning better throttle response. In engineering terms, it was efficient, balanced, refined. But nobody wanted refined in 1965. They wanted dominance. They wanted bragging rights. Refinement didn't sell cars. Cubic inches did. And then the emissions era showed up like a wrecking ball. By the late 1960s, everything changed. Compression ratios started falling, camshafts got softer, horsepower numbers dropped across the board. The 326 suffered more than most. Why? Because it never had a halo version to protect its reputation. There was no Ram Air 326, no factory race package, no special edition with hood scoops and aggressive graphics, no myth to carry it forward. The 389 had the GTO to keep its memory alive. The 421 had Super Duty legends. The 400 had Ram Air packages. The 326 was just an engine, and without a story, engines get forgotten. By 1968, Pontiac quietly made a decision. They stretched the 326 to 350 cubic inches. Same block family. Bore increased to 3.875 inches. Stroke stayed the same. The 350 replaced the 326 almost overnight. One year, it was in the catalog. The next year, it was gone. And just like that, the 326 was erased. No farewell, no tribute, no legend. Most people assumed it deserved to disappear. But here's what rarely gets talked about. The 326 block was overbuilt. Cylinder walls were thick enough that overboring wasn't risky if done conservatively. The main journals were robust, built to handle far more than stock power. The crankshafts didn't flex under load like some contemporary small blocks from other manufacturers. And the valve train geometry was classic Pontiac. Stable at RPMs, where other engines floated valves and lost control. In race trim, private builders were pushing these engines past 6,500 RPM reliably. Some claimed 7,000 on good days. That was unheard of for a small Pontiac V8. There are stories from grassroots drag racers in the mid-60s. Guys running 326 powered Tempests at local strips. No factory support, no magazine coverage. No sponsorship deals, just hard launches and long nights. Just the pure joy of going fast on a budget. One mechanic who built several race 326s later told a story. After a full season of abuse, hard launches, high RPM runs, the kind of treatment that should have destroyed any engine, he tore one down expecting to find carnage. The bearings looked brand new. No copper showing through, no heat damage, no scoring. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because someone designed the engine right. But without factory backing, those stories stayed local, and local stories don't become legends. Then came the insurance crackdowns, then the Clean Air Act, then the gas crisis. The end of high compression muscle came faster than anyone expected. Pontiac shifted focus to survival. Big engines faded from the lineup. Small engines became necessities. Ironically, this should have been the 326's moment. A small, efficient V8 with real torque and proven reliability? That was exactly what the market needed in 1974. But the 326 was already gone, killed off years before the world caught up to what it offered. By the mid-1970s, Pontiac V8s were shadows of their former selves. Smog pumps everywhere, low compression, single exhausts. The soul was gone. Enthusiasts looked back and remembered the monsters. The 421 Super Duty, the 455 HO, the engines that scared people. Nobody reminisced about the one that played by the rules. Today, surviving 326s are rare, not because they were fragile, but because nobody saved them. They got swapped out for bigger motors, pulled during restorations because a 400 made the car more valuable, left behind in junkyards to rust. And that's the final insult. Because if you look at it honestly, the 326 was one of Pontiac's smartest designs, a compact V8 with real torque, strong internals that could handle abuse, and street manners that modern enthusiasts would kill for. It didn't lose because it was bad. It lost because it was overshadowed. Overshadowed by bigger engines from its own family. Overshadowed by louder stories from racetracks it was never allowed to enter. Overshadowed by a muscle car culture that only celebrated extremes. So here's the hidden truth. The Pontiac 326 wasn't a failure. It was a victim of timing. It arrived just before the horsepower war went nuclear, and it disappeared just before efficiency mattered again. If it had been introduced 5 years later, it might have been a hero. If it had been allowed to race, it might have built a legend. But history doesn't care about if. It only remembers who shouted the loudest, and the 326 never shouted. It just worked, quietly, reliably, and without mercy for anyone who underestimated it. Somewhere out there, in a barn or a forgotten garage, there's probably a 326 still waiting, still intact, still capable, still overlooked. If you find one, treat it with respect, because you're looking at one of Detroit's best-kept secrets, an engine that deserved better, an engine that history forgot. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Detroit's most overlooked engines, let me know in the comments what you want next. Another forgotten V8, another rivalry that never made the headlines, and make sure to subscribe, because some of the best stories in automotive history are the ones nobody bothered to tell.